September 1st, 1939. It is an iconic date in world history. The start of the Second World War would usher in the most global and bloodiest war ever witnessed. And it was on that day that Hitler's forces invaded Poland. 2 days later, Great Britain declared war on Germany, with others following suit on that day and in the days and weeks thereafter. The war to end all wars, as World War I had famously been called by those horrified by its brutality, was but a distant memory. Poland was overpowered within 6 days. It simply couldn't match the overwhelming might of the Third Reich. But what became of Poland's navy, known as the Marynarka Wojenna, or War Navy? Well, it played an active role on the side of the Allies. It's a compelling story that we needed to share with you. On the day the Germans invaded Poland, the Polish Navy consisted of 4 destroyers, 5 submarines, 1 mine layer, and 6 modern minesweepers. It also had several auxiliary and a training ship, as well as patrol boats, tugboats, and small river vessels. The Polish Navy was primarily based in Gdynia, a seaport on the Baltic Sea in northern Poland. Most of the port and its naval base had only been built during the 1920s and 30s and was modest by any standards. The naval base housed about 325 officers and 3,300 sailors. The commander-in-chief of the Polish Navy was Rear Admiral Jerzy Swirsky, while Captain Karol Gustaw Koratowski acted as chief of staff. The largest and most modern of Poland's destroyers were the 2,144-ton Grom, which translates as Thunderbolt from Polish, and Błyskawica, or Lightning, which were built in England and launched in 1936. They were armed with 7 4.7-inch guns and 6 21-inch torpedo tubes. 2 other smaller destroyers were the 1,540-ton Burza, or Squall, and Witcher, or Hurricane. They were built in France between 1926 and 1930 and were armed with 4 5.1-inch guns and 6 torpedo tubes. They were slightly slower than their larger counterparts, being able to attain 33 knots. 3 of the 5 mine-laying submarines were French and launched in 1929. Being named Rice, or Lynx, Wilk, or Wolf, and Zibik, or Wildcat. The trio of subs were armed with 1 3.9-inch gun and 6 torpedo tubes each, and were capable of carrying up to 32 mines. The other 2 mine-laying submarines were built in the Netherlands between 1936 and 1939, and were called the Orzel, or Eagle, and the Sepp, or Vulture. Along with space for mines, they were also equipped with 8 torpedo tubes and a mounted 3.5-inch gun. Also forming part of Poland's navy was a diesel-powered surface mine layer, the Gierif, or Griffin, which was delivered from France in 1936 and had 6 mounted 4.7-inch guns and could carry 300 mines. There were 2 342-ton patrol boats, named the General Haller and the Commandant Pilsudski, and which carried 2 3-inch guns. They were quite aged vessels, having come by way of the Imperial Russian Navy, where they were built in 1914, and subsequently sold to Poland by Finland. The Navy further included a sail training ship, the Iskra, and a transporter named Wilja, as well as a surveying vessel and a submarine depot ship. A distinct feature of the Polish Navy was its river flotilla, which consisted of 6 small monitors of 70 to 110 tons each, 6 armed steamers of 100 to 200 tons each, and 30 motor patrol boats. So, whilst not a grand navy by European standards, the Polish Navy still had a presence and important role within the country's high command. However, many of these Polish ships were lost in the Baltic due to bombardments by Germany's Luftwaffe. Thankfully, not all was lost. It had already been decided between Great Britain and Poland prior to Germany's invasion that the 2 countries would enter into a naval pact. This agreement happened in March of 1939. You see, although the Germans invaded months later on September 1st of 1939, both Britain and Poland knew by early 1939 that it was only a matter of time before Hitler did so. Both countries also knew that Poland's navy didn't stand a chance against the Germans, who, by the way, had hardly needed its Kriegsmarine to help invade Poland. Such was the superiority of Germany's land and air forces, or Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, respectively. It was in August 1939 that the so-called Peking Plan, or Operation Peking, took place. The plan entailed getting 3 of Poland's destroyers over to Britain so that they could at least be spared being destroyed by Germany. Importantly, the 3 ships could then play their role in Allied naval missions. The 3 destroyers were the aforementioned Burza, Błyskawica, and Grom. It was also decided to do this before any German invasion occurred, since the Straits of Denmark through which ships had to travel to get to Britain were both very narrow and very close to German ports and air cover. They would never succeed in getting to Britain once hostilities broke out. The signing of the Polish-British Common Defense Pact was done on August 25, 1939. The order for the so-called Peking Plan was signed the next day, August 26th, by the commander of the Polish fleet, Counter-Admiral Józef Unrug. That was just 6 days before Germany invaded Poland. The actual order for the ships to set sail for Britain came at 12:55 hours on August 29th, when the Polish fleet received the signal, Peking, 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 from the Polish High Command. Even though it was just days before the invasion, the Polish ships were able to sail through the Baltic unhindered. They even came across the German light cruiser Königsberg, but war had still not broken out, so the German ship did nothing. The Polish ships were even tracked by German reconnaissance seaplanes on August 31st, the very day before Poland got invaded. The ships took evasive action by changing course towards Norway, and thereafter switching back to their original course towards Britain. The 3 ships were still in the North Sea when they learned of the German invasion of their country at 0925 on September 1st. They were met by the Royal Navy destroyers HMS Wanderer and HMS Wallace at 12:58 that same day, finally docking at Leith, the port of Edinburgh, Scotland, at 17:37. Poland had been under German attack for just over 8 hours by then. The Peking Plan may have had its detractors in Poland, but it was the right thing to do. After all, every other surface ship of the Polish Navy which had remained in the Baltic was either eventually sunk or captured by the German Kriegsmarine, starting on the very first day of the invasion at the Battle of Gdansk. 2 of Poland's major remaining warships, the destroyer Witcher and the heavy mine layer Graef, were already both sunk and at the bottom of the Baltic by September 3, 1939. Poland's home navy was in ruins. In the aftermath of the Peking Plan, a more formal Anglo-Polish naval agreement was signed on November 18, 1939. The British gave the Poles many concessions, including that the Polish naval detachment now stationed in Britain was to be commanded by Polish officers, with all its ships manned by Polish crews, who would wear Polish uniforms according to Polish Navy ranks and subject to Polish regulation. They would of course remain under the operational control of the British Admiralty. But, importantly to the Poles, all their ships would remain sovereign Polish territory. 2 of the 5 Polish submarines had managed to escape the carnage above surface. The Wilk had been badly damaged and needed to take on emergency repairs for more than 5 days while lying at the bottom of the Baltic. It then proceeded on its 9-day journey to Scotland, having to maneuver her way around the heavily mined waters between Denmark and Sweden. She arrived safely on September 20th. The other Polish sub, the Orzel, had an even more adventurous time before reaching Britain. She narrowly escaped being hit by German warships and planes and had to take safe harbor in Tallinn, the main port and capital city of Estonia. The Estonians, under pressure from the Germans, promptly seized the Polish submarine. But the captain and crew of the Orzel were not to be deterred, and so they hacked and sawed through steel cables to release the Orzel from the dock and fled with her to sea under heavy fire from the shore. She finally reached Britain on October 14th, after even more travails on the way. The 3 original destroyers that had escaped under the Peking Plan had formed the Polish Destroyer Squadron, and besides Leith, they would visit a number of Scottish ports, including Rosyth, Greenock, Port Glasgow, Dundee, and the large naval base at Scapa Flow. The squadron would initially have its operations base at Plymouth in southern England, for which the 3 ships would be involved in clandestine operations off southern Ireland, as well as escort duties. The Polish squadron then moved to the port of Harwich in England's southeast coast to be better located for tours in the North Sea. By this time, it was the first time in the history of the Polish Navy that it was fighting in 2 seas, namely the North Sea and the Baltic. Germany's invasions of Denmark and Norway in 1940 meant that the Polish contingency had to be on active duty out of British ports. The early summer of 1940 was a bad one for the Polish Navy in that it lost one of its 2 submarines and one of its 3 destroyers. However, the British handed over its ship, HMS Garland, to the Poles, who in turn renamed it with the Polish designation ORP Garland. The prefix ORP is the traditional ship prefix in the Polish Navy and stands for Warship of the Republic of Poland in Polish. The Polish also received 2 French Navy patrol vessels and 2 submarine chasers, which had been abandoned by their crews in British waters when Germany invaded France. The French patrol vessels were named the Medoc and the Pomerol, while the 2 submarine chasers were simply designated Chach 11 and Chach 12. There were further additions to the Polish fleet consisting of 12 trawlers that had belonged to Belgium, yet another country which had been invaded by the Germans and abandoned its boats to the British. The Belgian boats, numbered P1 to P12, were based at Dartmouth for anti-invasion patrols along the English coast. Also on hand for the Polish were their own ships, the transporter Wilja and the training ship Iskra. They had also managed to escape the Nazi invasion. The 3 original destroyers in the Polish fleet were quick to earn high praise from the British Admiralty for their strategic prowess and the bravery of their Polish crews. For example, 2 of the Polish destroyers had done much to assist British light forces in repelling German air attacks on a convoy in the southern North Sea in early November 1939. Both the Polish submarines Orzel and Wilk had also been actively involved in trying to counter the German invasion of Norway in early April 1940. On the 8th of April, the Orzel sighted a German freighter, the Rio de Janeiro, in Danish waters. She issued a warning which the German freighter ignored, and so fired a torpedo which caused the German ship to list badly. A second torpedo immediately sank the Rio de Janeiro. Turns out, it was an excellent and important hit, since the German freighter was laden with precious cargo that included tanks and ammunition, as well as several hundred fully equipped German soldiers. By October 1940, the Polish destroyers were involved in the famous Battle of the Atlantic, in which German U-boats wreaked havoc on Allied shipping, and particularly merchant shipping. The Polish destroyers acted as escorts for transatlantic convoys, itself highly hazardous work, given that constant threat of the ominous U-boats. Here too the Polish ships and their crew once again impressed the British High Command. The list of battles and naval engagements in which the Polish ships and submarines took part is a long and illustrious one. They included the Battle of Dunkirk, the Allied raids on the Lofoten Islands in Norway, the siege of Tobruk of what was then Italian Libya, the convoys to Murmansk in the Soviet Arctic Circle, the landings at Dieppe Forest in Belgium, the landings in the Azores Islands of Portugal, the landing at Anzio in central Italy, not to mention the landings at Normandy in June 1944. They were also involved in the relentless tracking and eventual sinking of the iconic German battleship, the Bismarck. That doesn't include numerous missions and patrols in the North Sea, English Channel, the Baltic, and the Mediterranean. However, one cannot speak of Poland's naval contribution to the Allied war effort without mentioning and acknowledging the priceless role that its merchant navy played as well. 38 Polish merchant vessels had succeeded in escaping the German invasion of Poland, and they were quickly integrated into the Allied merchant pool. Like the Polish Navy, the merchant ships with their Polish crews became synonymous with bravery and clever diversion tactics. Here then is a roll call of just some of the Polish merchant fleet's successful military-related missions: the transport of Allied troops to Norway, the evacuation of British and Polish troops from France in 1940, the transport of Canadian and then later American troops to Europe, and heavy involvement in some of the Allies' largest-scale landings, including those in North Africa and Salerno in Italy, as well as the famous Normandy landings. Civilian missions included transporting valuable cargoes to North Africa and the Arctic port of Murmansk. Polish merchant ships were also involved in the transport of European and British children to the safety of the United States. By the end of the war, the Polish Navy had sailed a total of 1,213,000 nautical miles, or nearly 2.25 million kilometers, had been involved in 787 convoys, and carried out 1,162 combat patrols. Polish vessels had sunk 39 Axis transport ships, shot down 20 aircraft, and sunk 2 U-boats, having damaged up to 11 of the German submarines. 404 Polish sailors would lose their lives during this time. More than a year after the war had ended, Vice Admiral Jerzy Swirsky, the commander-in-chief of the Polish Navy, had this to say: "Thus we come to the end of the glorious pages of the history of our Navy, the armed forces of Poland on the high seas, the glorious part played by our Navy, and the proud memory of our ships, which for us constitute a part of our country and our homes, will forever remain in our hearts."